Long before Athens became a symbol of reason and democracy, it was a land of tension and quiet suffering where wealth was held by a few families and the many lived close to hunger and uncertainty. And in this world, Pisistratus was born not into greatness but into possibility. Mixed with frustration, his family carried noble blood and proud stories of heroic ancestors, yet their lands were modest and their influence limited, and from the beginning this balance shaped his mind, teaching him that status could open doors, but could not guarantee power. His early years passed not in the crowded assemblies of the city, but in the open countryside of Attica, where the soil was thin, the seasons unforgiving, and the people deeply aware of how fragile life could be there. He watched farmers measure their hopes against rain clouds and debt collectors, and he learned that survival often mattered more than justice, and order more than freedom. As a child, he listened quietly to men who believed no one important cared what they thought, and these conversations stayed with him, planting questions about why some ruled and others endured. As he grew older, he showed an unusual patience. He did not rush to speak or act. Instead, he observed, storing impressions and emotions, learning how fear changed voices and how hope softened anger. His education followed the path expected of a young noble, learning poetry, law, and tradition. Yet his true lessons came from contrast, seeing how the law protected some while leaving others exposed, and this awareness formed early the belief that law itself was not good or evil, but powerful depending on who guided it. As a young man, he trained as a soldier and found comfort in discipline, structure, and silence. He understood commands, the value of timing, and the strength of restraint. And unlike others, he did not seek glory in battle but clarity. He wanted to understand how men followed orders and why they obeyed some leaders more readily than others. People noticed his calm presence, his ability to remain steady when others grew loud, and this steadiness gave him influence without spectacle. Internally, he began to shape a quiet ambition, not the reckless hunger for domination, but a controlled desire to direct events rather than endure them. He believed disorder harmed the weak most of all, and that a single guiding hand, even a firm one, could prevent suffering. This belief did not come without conflict, for he knew that power demanded compromise and sometimes deception, and this knowledge troubled him, yet did not stop him. Athens itself reflected this inner division, torn between factions: the wealthy landowners of the plains, the traders of the coast, and the poor hill people who felt forgotten. And Pisistratus saw clearly what others denied, that the city could not survive long in balance without someone willing to stand between these forces. His earliest political steps were cautious. He spoke little, promised to stability, and presented himself not as a challenger to tradition, but as its protector. And when a small military success brought him attention, he did not celebrate publicly, allowing others to tell the story for him, because he understood that admiration given freely lasted longer than praise demanded. And as his name spread, so did the quiet sense that he was different, that he listened, that he remembered, that he understood. And in these early moments, before deception, before exile, before power fully claimed him, Pisistratus stood at the edge of history, shaped by a world that taught him patience, fear, and the dangerous truth that people often choose certainty over freedom when the future feels uncertain. As Pisistratus moved deeper into the life of the city, his understanding of Athens grew sharper and heavier, and with it, the weight of choice began to press upon him, because knowledge once gained could not be forgotten, and what he now saw clearly was a city quietly breaking itself apart. The noble families argued over honor and precedence, while the common people argued with empty hands and unpaid debts, and between them stood laws that promised fairness yet delivered unevenly. And Pisistratus felt this imbalance not as an abstract idea, but as a living tension that followed him through streets and gatherings and private conversations. He began to realize that many Athenians no longer trusted the city to protect them, and that distrust bred anger, and anger waited only for direction. During this time, he kept his personal life restrained. He married and formed alliances as custom required, but he did not allow comfort to soften his focus, because he believed indulgence dulled judgment. and he feared losing the careful control he had built within himself. His nights were often restless, not from guilt, but from calculation. Weighing paths that all carried cost, he could remain honorable and powerless or step into the uncertain space where order could be imposed, but at the price of purity, and this internal struggle shaped his psychology, turning him inward, sharpening his patience, and teaching him to hide doubt behind calm expression. When factional conflict intensified and voices in the assembly grew more bitter, Pisistratus did not shout, he waited, and when he spoke he framed himself as a mediator, a man who understood both tradition and suffering, and this balance made him useful to many and threatening to some. It was during this period that he first realized the power of image, how stories traveled faster than facts, and how perception shaped loyalty more than reason. He learned to let others defend him, because defense offered by followers appeared more genuine than words spoken for oneself, and so his reputation grew quietly, strengthened by restraint. When violence between factions flared, he positioned himself as a victim of extremism rather than its author, and this decision was deliberate because he understood that fear united people more effectively than admiration. The defining moment came when he appeared wounded before the assembly, his body marked, his clothing stained, and his voice controlled as he claimed he had been attacked for standing with the poor. The sight struck the city deeply because it reflected what many already believed, that speaking for the powerless was dangerous, and in that moment, sympathy overcame caution, and the assembly granted him a personal guard, a small decision that carried immense consequence, because it shifted power from shared trust to armed protection, and Pisistratus accepted it with humility, masking the knowledge that he had crossed a line within himself, choosing survival and order over transparency. This was not an impulsive act, but the result of long observation and internal debate. He believed that once stability was secured, honesty could return, but he did not know whether power ever truly released those who held it soon. Rival factions united against him, alarmed by how easily he had gained protection and influence, and they forced him into exile, stripping him of authority, yet unable to erase his presence, because his story had already taken root. Exile tested him. Deeply removed from the city, he sought to control. He was forced into reflection and patience, and there he learned that power taken too quickly could be taken just as quickly, and that return required not force but timing and belief. He watched Athens from afar, noting its continued instability and understanding that the same divisions that expelled him would eventually invite him back if he presented himself not as conqueror but as solution, and so he planned not with urgency but with discipline, refining the image. He would return with understanding that cities, like people, often accepted illusion when truth offered no comfort, and when the moment came, he returned not as a general but as a symbol, accompanied by spectacle and divine suggestion, presenting himself alongside a woman dressed as Athena, the city's protector. And many Athenians accepted this vision because belief filled a void reason could not, and in accepting it, they participated in their own persuasion. Pisistratus understood this deeply, and it confirmed what exile had taught him, that authority rested not only on strength, but on shared desire for order and meaning. And with this understanding, he stepped again into power, not triumphantly, but carefully, aware that every step forward bound him tighter to the role he had chosen, and that the path of control once entered rarely allowed return to innocence. As Pisistratus settled once more into Athens, the city watched him closely, measuring not his promises, but his restraint, because memory was still fresh and trust remained cautious, and he understood this fully, knowing that his survival now depended less on force than on balance and patience. He did not purge his enemies, nor did he dismantle the councils or courts. Instead, he allowed familiar rituals to continue, allowing Athenians to believe that their city still belonged to them, even as his. Influence quietly shaped outcomes behind the scenes. He governed through presence, rather than proclamation appearing in public. Not as a conqueror, but as a stabilizing figure who listened, approved, and intervened only when disorder threatened to spread. And this approach softened resistance, because it denied opponents the image of a tyrant to rally against internally. However, Pisistratus carried constant tension, aware that every act of mercy could be read as weakness, and every act of control as betrayal of the image he had carefully built. He surrounded himself with advisors chosen not for loyalty alone but for competence, understanding that stability required capable administration, and he placed allies in key positions not abruptly, but gradually, so that change appeared natural rather than imposed. His policies focused first on the countryside, because he knew that hunger bred unrest, and unrest traveled from farms to city walls. He offered loans to farmers, reduced the pressure of debt, and ensured that small landholders could survive poor seasons, and in doing so he bound rural loyalty to his rule. Not through fear but gratitude, a quieter and more enduring bond. He funded public works not to glorify himself, but to employ the poor, keeping idle hands busy and minds occupied, and these projects reshaped Athens slowly. Roads improved, wells were dug, temples restored, and each stone laid carried the unspoken message that order had returned with him. Religion played a central role in his strategy, yet not cynically. He understood that shared belief unified the city more deeply than law ever could. And so he expanded festivals, honored traditional gods, and elevated communal rituals, making his rule feel aligned with divine rhythm rather than political ambition. And through these acts he wove himself into the cultural life of Athens, until separating ruler from city became increasingly difficult psychologically. Pisistratus struggled with isolation because power demanded distance, and he could no longer speak freely, even in private, unsure where loyalty ended and calculation began. Yet he accepted this solitude as necessary, believing that a single guiding will require personal sacrifice. And when whispers of dissent reached him, he responded selectively, ignoring minor criticisms while quietly removing threats before they grew visible. This restraint prevented open rebellion, but deepened his reliance on surveillance and trusted intermediaries. And although his rule was mild compared to others, the awareness that it rested on careful manipulation never left him. And in moments of reflection he questioned whether the order he preserved justified the methods he used, yet each time unrest threatened and subsided. His belief hardened that his path, however imperfect, was preferable to chaos, and Athens during these years experienced relative calm. Trade increased, art flourished, and the city breathed more easily than it had in decades. But beneath the surface, the idea of shared rule weakened as people grew accustomed to stability delivered by one man, and Pisistratus recognized this shift with both satisfaction and unease, knowing that dependency could secure his legacy, yet endanger the city after him. And this awareness began to shape his thoughts toward the future, toward succession and continuity, because even as he ruled effectively, time reminded him quietly that no power was permanent, and that the structures he built would eventually be tested by his absence. And so the question slowly formed, not whether Athens prospered under him, but what would remain when he was gone, and whether the balance he imposed could survive without his guiding hand. As the years passed and Pisistratus aged into his authority, his attention turned inward toward endurance rather than conquest, because he understood that true power was measured not by how it was taken, but by how long it could be held without collapse. And this awareness shaped his every decision. He began to think less like a challenger and more like a guardian of continuity, watching the city not with the hunger of ambition, but with the caution of a man who knew how fragile stability truly was. He refined his control, not by tightening it, but by making it less visible, allowing Athenians to believe that order had become natural rather than enforced. And this illusion required constant maintenance, because human memory is short. Yet resentment lingers longer than gratitude. He invested deeply in culture, understanding that stories, songs, and shared celebrations outlived decrees, and so poets found patronage, artists found space, and public festivals grew richer, binding joy itself for the period of his rule. And when people spoke of peace, prosperity, and ritual, they unknowingly spoke of him, and this pleased him, yet also unsettled him, because it confirmed how easily a city could forget its own agency psychologically. He felt the strain of living as both benefactor and manipulator, and in private moments, he confronted the quiet truth that he could no longer step away without unraveling what he had built, and this realization deepened his sense of isolation because power once stabilized demanded constant presence. He trusted few and tested many, listening carefully for shifts in tone rather than overt opposition, because experience had taught him that rebellion rarely announced itself openly, and he relied increasingly on his sons, preparing them not merely to inherit authority, but to understand its weight and danger. He taught them patience above strength and discretion above pride, because he feared that arrogance would undo what calculation had preserved. And yet he knew that inheritance carried risk, because loyalty to a ruler did not always transfer cleanly to his blood, and this knowledge troubled him deeply. Even as he maintained confidence in public, his rule continued without major upheaval, but tension never fully disappeared. It merely slept, and Pisistratus sensed it in small ways, in silences that lasted too long, in conversations that ended too carefully, and these signs reminded him that peace under a single will was always conditional and dependent on balance. He avoided unnecessary cruelty, not from mercy alone, but from strategy, believing that fear must be measured to remain effective, and that excessive force sharpened resistance rather than erasing it. And so his governance remained restrained, pragmatic, and deliberate, yet always aware of the line he walked between order and oppression. As time moved forward and his health slowly declined, he became more reflective, considering not how history would judge him, but how memory would shape him, whether he would be remembered as a stabilizer or a deceiver, a protector or a usurper. And he understood that memory belonged not to the ruler, but to those who lived after him. And as Athens continued to function under his guidance, the city itself seemed unaware that it was being quietly transformed from a community of shared responsibility into one accustomed to being guided. And this transformation, though subtle, carried consequences that would unfold long after his voice fell silent. And as Pisistratus moved closer to the end of his life, he accepted that no ruler could fully control their legacy, only influence the conditions in which it would grow. And with this acceptance came a restrained peace, not triumph, not regret, but the calm of a man who had chosen his path, fully aware of its cost and necessity. As Pisistratus entered the later years of his life, his relationship with power changed, subtly becoming less about control in the moment and more about the shadow he would leave behind, because age brings with it a different kind of fear, not the fear of enemies, but the fear of unraveling. And he understood that systems built around a single will were strongest when that will still breathed, and weakest when it faded. And this knowledge stayed with him in quiet hours when the city slept and decisions weighed heavier than before. He observed his sons closely, measuring not their ambition but their restraint, because he had learned through experience that impatience destroyed what patience built. And he spoke to them not in grand lessons but in small warnings, about listening more than speaking, about waiting for the right moment, and about never believing their own image, because admiration, once accepted as truth, could quickly become blindness. Under his rule, Athens continued to prosper. Fields yielded trade routes, remained open, festivals filled the calendar, and the people lived with a sense of predictability unknown to earlier generations. Yet this very comfort carried a hidden cost, because the habit of self-governance weakened quietly as citizens grew used to solutions arriving from above. And Pisistratus noticed this with mixed feeling, understanding that stability had softened vigilance, and that dependence felt like peace until it was tested. He did not attempt to reverse this shift, because doing so would require surrendering authority, and he had long accepted that his role demanded sacrifice, not only of innocence but of shared control. He continued to avoid overt brutality, knowing that excessive force left scars that outlived rulers, and instead he relied on presence, reputation, and the quiet understanding that resistance would gain little and risk much as his health declined. He withdrew slightly from public life, allowing others to speak in his name and watching how the city responded to absence rather than command, and these moments taught him that order could endure briefly without him, but not without structure, and this realization confirmed both the success and the danger of his rule, because he had built stability yet tied it closely to his household rather than the collective will, and in this truth lay both his achievement and his flaw. When Pisistratus finally died, his passing was calm without upheaval, and Athens did not erupt into chaos immediately, which some saw as proof of his success and others as evidence of quiet dependence. His sons assumed authority, inheriting not only power but expectation and fear, and while the city continued along the path he had set, the balance he had maintained through personal discipline began to strain, because what had been measured through experience now rested in younger hands, and Pisistratus himself passed into memory, neither fully condemned nor fully praised his life, leaving behind a city more orderly than he had found it, yet less practiced in governing itself. And this paradox would shape Athens in the years to come, as future generations would debate not what he had done, but what his rule had taught them about power, responsibility, and the cost of choosing stability over shared rule. As Pisistratus faded from the living world and passed fully into memory, the city entered a new phase shaped not by his hand, but by the habits he had cultivated, and this transition revealed truths that had been hidden beneath years of calm, because systems tested without their architect often expose what was strength and what was illusion. His sons stepped forward to rule, inheriting authority that had been carefully prepared yet never guaranteed. And while they carried his name, they did not carry his full restraint or patience. And Athens felt this difference not immediately, but gradually, in tone and judgment, and in the subtle hardening of power where once it had been softened by calculation. The people continued their lives, working, trading, worshiping, and celebrating as before, yet a quiet unease began to settle, because leadership now felt less distant, yet less understanding, and where Pisistratus had listened before acting, his sons acted more quickly, trusting the authority already granted to them, and this shift altered the emotional contract between ruler and ruled, because stability, once earned through balance, now relied more heavily on fear and expectation, and the city sensed this, even if it could not yet name it. Resentment did not rise openly, but memory returned, and older Athenians began to recall the time before a single household guided the city, and younger men who had never known true political uncertainty began to question why their voices mattered less than they had been taught in stories about the past, and these questions lingered quietly, waiting for opportunity. The sons of Pisistratus maintained order but lacked his instinct for restraint and subtlety, and in doing so, they revealed how much of the earlier peace had depended not on structure alone, but on the personality of the man who held it together. Opposition began to form, slowly, not from hunger or desperation, but from pride and memory, because when material needs are met, people turn inward toward dignity and participation, and this was something that tyranny could not easily provide. And so the legacy of Pisistratus became more complex as time passed. He was remembered by some as a bringer of peace and prosperity, and by others as the man who taught Athens to accept guidance over debate. And this divided memory fed political tension, because history itself became a tool used by both sides to justify resistance or obedience. And when violence eventually returned to the city, it felt sharper because it broke a long calm, and the sons of Pisistratus responded with force rather than patience, accelerating the cycle their father had spent his life delaying. And in this escalation, the limits of inherited power became clear, because authority earned through balance could not simply be passed down like property, and Athens moved toward confrontation, not suddenly but inevitably, as old factions reawakened and new leaders emerged, promising not order alone, but participation and dignity, and the city stood once more at a crossroads, shaped by the choices of a man long gone yet still present in every structure, habit and fear he had left behind. And in this unfolding future, Pisistratus lived on, not as a ruler but as a question, reminder that power taken to prevent chaos could itself become the seed of transformation, and that history rarely ends with the death of a man, but continues through the consequences of what he taught others to accept. As tension slowly hardened into resistance, Athens began to change in ways that were subtle yet irreversible, because the habits of obedience formed under Pisistratus now collided with a growing desire to reclaim voice and dignity, and this collision did not announce itself with immediate violence, but with unease that moved through conversations, glances and silences. The sons of Pisistratus ruled with authority, inherited yet not fully earned, and while they attempted to maintain the appearance of continuity, the city sensed that something essential had shifted, because rule now felt narrower, less patient, less aware of the fragile balance between fear and consent that their father had mastered. Opposition gathered not only among the poor, but among former allies, aristocrats who had tolerated Pisistratus because he restrained himself but now feared a future where restraint no longer guided power, and these men began to speak quietly with one another, recalling traditions of shared rule and invoking memory as both weapon and refuge. The people listened because memory carried weight, and because comfort without dignity eventually breeds restlessness, and as resentment grew, it found symbols, martyrs, and moments around which emotion could gather. And one such moment came when an act of personal violence by one of the ruling sons shattered the remaining illusion of benevolent authority, turning private outrage into public resolve. And in that instant, fear began to change sides, because what had once protected the rulers now fueled resistance, and Athens moved toward open defiance, not out of desperation, but conviction. Alliances formed across old factional lines, bound together by the shared belief that stability without voice was no longer enough, and that the cost of silence had grown too high. And as the city stirred, foreign powers watched carefully, sensing opportunity where division appeared and intervention became possible. And thus the legacy of Pisistratus extended beyond Athens itself, influencing how others viewed the city as vulnerable once again. And when the final collapse came, it did not feel sudden but overdue. The sons were driven out, the tyranny ended, and Athens stood at the edge of transformation, forced to confront what it had lost and what it might reclaim. And in the aftermath, reflection began slowly, painfully, as citizens debated not only the cruelty of the final years, but the comfort of the earlier ones, and whether the peace Pisistratus had provided had been worth the habits of dependence it created. And from this debate, new political ideas began to take shape, grounded in the determination not to repeat the same surrender of collective responsibility. And thus, even in absence, Pisistratus continued to shape the city, not as a ruler, but as a lesson etched into memory, reminding Athens that order imposed could preserve a city for a time, but only shared ownership could sustain it across generations. As Athens emerged from the fall of tyranny, the city found itself standing in unfamiliar silence, a silence filled not with peace but with possibility and uncertainty, because the removal of a ruling household did not immediately restore confidence in shared rule, and many citizens felt both relief and unease, having lived so long under guided stability that freedom now felt heavy and untested. And in this moment, Pisistratus remained present in absence, because every debate, every proposal, every fear carried the memory of what his rule had given and taken away. Leaders began to speak, not as masters but as persuaders, understanding that authority now required consent rather than obedience. And this shift marked a profound psychological change within the city, because citizens were no longer merely subjects of order, but participants in its creation. And this participation was neither easy nor harmonious. Old divisions resurfaced, yet they were now expressed through argument rather than force, because the city had learned through experience that unchecked power, even when mild, carried hidden costs. And so structures were Reimagined laws reshaped and councils strengthened not as perfect solutions, but as safeguards against the return of singular dominance. And throughout these changes, Pisistratus became a reference point, not a villain to be erased nor a hero to be restored, but a reminder of how easily fear could invite control and how comfort could dull vigilance. And this memory influenced decisions, quietly shaping reforms that aimed to distribute authority more broadly so that no single figure could again become indispensable. And in this way, the city began to transform its pain into structure, turning experience into principle. And while conflict did not disappear, it gained boundaries and process, and the people slowly relearned the discipline of disagreement, the patience of debate, and the burden of responsibility. And this learning was slow, uneven, and often frustrating, yet it carried a depth that stability imposed from above never could. And as generations passed, Pisistratus faded further into history, yet his shadow remained visible in the city's caution, its suspicion of concentrated power, and its awareness that leadership required limits. And thus his life continued to echo not in monuments or decrees, but in the habits of a city determined to remember both the calm he provided and the cost at which it came. And in this remembrance, Athens began to define itself anew, not by the absence of tyranny alone, but by the conscious effort to guard against its quiet return. As time moved forward and the wounds of tyranny slowly closed, memory itself began to change, because what people remember is shaped not only by truth but by need. And Pisistratus gradually shifted from living recollection into historical figure, his name spoken less with anger and more with reflection. And this transformation mattered because it revealed how Athens was learning to understand its own past rather than simply react to it. Older citizens who had lived under his rule spoke of full granaries, steady laws, and quiet streets, while younger generations spoke of lost voices, delayed freedom, and the danger of trusting stability too easily. And between these views, a deeper understanding began to form that history was rarely pure, and that a single life could carry both benefit and harm. And this realization shaped the city's growing political identity, because Athens did not reject order, nor did it reject authority. It sought instead to divide power so that no individual could again become the sole answer to fear and uncertainty. And in debates, assemblies, and legal reforms, Pisistratus appeared again and again, not as an enemy, but as a measure, a reminder of how far power could stretch when invited, and how difficult it was to reclaim once surrendered. And this awareness influenced the city's culture, its drama, poetry, and public memory, where stories explored the tension between fate, choice, ambition, and restraint. And in these stories, the figure of the ruler often appeared not as monster, but as man shaped by circumstance and desire. And this nuance reflected a maturing society, one that had learned that evil rarely arrives announcing itself, and that even calm authority must be watched carefully. And as Athens continued to evolve, developing systems that encouraged participation, argument, and accountability, the memory of Pisistratus remained embedded in its caution and its confidence, because the city now knew both what it gained from order and what it risked by relying on one will. And in this balance, Athens found a new strength, grounded not in perfection, but in awareness. And it was this awareness, born partly from the long, quiet rule of Pisistratus, that allowed the city to move forward, carrying its past not as a burden, but as a guide. And in this way, his legacy became inseparable from the very identity of Athens, not as a tyrant alone, nor as a savior, but as a chapter through which the city learned who it was and what it refused to become. As Athens continued to grow into its new identity, the figure of Pisistratus remained woven into its sense of caution and self-awareness, not as a living influence, but as a quiet presence in how decisions were framed and limits were defended, because the city had learned through experience that the greatest danger was not cruelty alone, but comfort that asked for surrender. And this lesson shaped how power was spoken about, how leaders were chosen, and how authority was questioned. And even as New reforms took shape, and participation widened. The memory of a single guiding hand lingered as both temptation and warning, reminding citizens how easily responsibility could be handed away when fear promised safety. And in this atmosphere, Pisistratus came to represent a turning point rather than an ending, a moment when Athens saw clearly what it could become if it allowed one voice to stand in place of many. And this understanding did not erase conflict or ambition, but it gave those forces boundaries and language, and in doing so it allowed the city to channel struggle into structure rather than submission. And over time, this transformation became one of Athens' defining strengths, the ability to argue openly, to change leadership without blood, and to remember that stability gained without shared effort was always temporary. And thus the life of Pisistratus, long after his death, continued to shape not laws or offices, but instincts, teaching the city to question calm, to test authority, and to value participation, even when it was difficult and slow. And in this way, his legacy moved beyond his own actions, becoming part of a broader historical rhythm where individual ambition collided with collective memory, and out of that collision emerged a society more conscious of its own power and its own responsibility. And as generations passed, the name Pisistratus no longer inspired fear or loyalty alone, but reflection, a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who rule, but by those who allow themselves to be ruled, and that the true measure of a city lies not in how peacefully it obeys, but in how carefully it chooses who may lead and for how long. As the story of Pisistratus settled fully into the long flow of time, it began to lose the sharp edges of politics and take on the quieter weight of meaning, because when power is no longer present, it becomes something else, a mirror rather than a force. And Athens now looked back, not to judge him alone, but to understand itself through him. And in this looking back, the city recognized that Pisistratus had not appeared by accident, nor ruled by chance. He had risen because the city had needed relief from fear and division, and he had endured because people had accepted guidance when uncertainty felt heavier than surrender. And this recognition did not excuse his deception nor condemn his restraint, but placed them within the larger truth that societies often create the conditions for their own rulers. And in this truth lay a deeper maturity, because Athens no longer told itself simple stories of villains and heroes, but accepted that stability and freedom exist in constant tension, each demanding sacrifice and vigilance. And as this understanding spread, it shaped how Athenians spoke to one another, how they educated their children, and how they remembered their past teaching that law must be guarded not only from violence, but from convenience, and that participation required effort even when silence felt easier. And thus Pisistratus became part of a shared cautionary memory, not feared, not celebrated, but respected, as a reminder of how close order and control can stand, and how thin the line is between protection and possession. And this awareness allowed Athens to move forward with humility, because it knew it had once chosen certainty over voice, and that it could do so again if memory faded. And in this humility lay resilience, because remembering past surrender strengthened future resistance. And as centuries passed and the city faced new challenges, new leaders, and new threats, the quiet lesson of Pisistratus remained present, reminding each generation that power rarely arrives announcing itself as tyranny, and that the most enduring influence is often the one that feels reasonable, necessary, and calm. And in this way, the life of Pisistratus continued to speak not through monuments or laws, but through the careful hesitation that followed whenever any one man promised to hold the city together alone. As the long echo of Pisistratus finally settles into silence, his life remains not as a closed story, but as an open question, carried forward by time, because what he represents cannot be confined to one era or one judgment. He was born from division and fear, and he responded with order, patience, and control. And for a time the city breathed easier under his guidance. Yet that same calm slowly taught Athens how easy it was to rest responsibility in the hands of one man and how difficult it was to reclaim once surrendered, and in this truth his legacy becomes deeper than success or failure, because it lives in the tension between relief and restraint, between the desire for safety and the burden of shared rule. Pisistratus did not destroy Athens, nor did he complete it. He paused it, reshaped it, and passed it forward, changed by the habits he introduced and the lessons he left behind. And when he died, the city did not collapse, nor did it remain the same. Instead, it moved, carrying both gratitude and caution forward into a future that would test those lessons again and again. And this is how history truly endures, not as memory alone, but as influence, woven into decisions, instincts, and fears, long after names fade. And so the life of Pisistratus reminds us quietly that power often enters through need, not cruelty, that control can wear the face of care, and that time judges not only rulers, but the societies that allow them to rise and endure. And as generations look back across the long road of Athens, they do not see a monster nor a savior, but a man shaped by his world, who shaped it in return, leaving behind a city wiser, more cautious, and forever aware that order gained without vigilance is never free, and that memory itself is the final guardian against the quiet return of unchecked power.